Order, and welcome to today's session of the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, where we have our first oral evidence session on a new inquiry, the workforce planning to deliver clean, secure energy. Today's first public session is to explore the key themes of written evidence that we've received in a cross-cutting manner from the point of view of three eminent academics who have provided comprehensive submissions. You are all very welcome. Thank you very much for your contributions so far, and we look forward to hearing from you in detail. But if you could introduce yourselves, then we will start the questions, and I will start on my left with you, sir.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Dr. Calvillo, Senior Research Fellow from the Centre for Energy Policy, University of Strathclyde.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Richard Hanna. I'm a Research Associate at Imperial College London.
I'm James Robson. I'm Director of the Oxford University Centre for Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance at the Department of Education at Oxford.
Well, thank you all very much and welcome. The Office for Clean Energy Jobs has said in its assessment published in December last year that it has shown a shortage of skills in engineering, welding and mechanical trades, electrical trades, planning, managerial roles, among other occupations, with these facing both acute near-term shortages and long-term challenges. To what extent are they right? And what lessons can the three of you draw on from previous workforce challenges faced by the UK? And I'll ask you all in turn to answer that as an opener, but Christian Calvillo, go first, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's an excellent question, and probably we need to agree on it's an unprecedented challenge. We have done work at the Centre for Energy Policy on this area. Much of my work has been focused on jobs and skills, along on other economic and policy challenges across the net zero space. So we have seen this as part of our research, and I think there is an unprecedented scale here. And there is a phrase that I like to use: is net zero is everything, everywhere, all at once. And that's what is, I guess, unprecedented from other previous transitions. Having said that, there are some lessons that we can learn from previous. There was the good example here of the natural gas transition from town gas that happened fairly quickly. At my stats I found is that about 14 million consumers switched over a decade. So that was quite rapid and involved a massive level of coordination across different levels of government, across different sectors as well, and over a sustained period of time. So that helped drive this transition. At the same time, there are things that we probably want to avoid. Offshoring is one key example here. We have seen that some communities, for example, in Scotland, the steel industry in the 90s, the communities of Motherwell and Hamilton, they still haven't recovered after the shot of the steel industry over there. So there are things that we need to be careful about as well that we can learn from the past.
Thank you very much. And Richard, Hanna, next, please.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to make a similar point on the coal gas to town gas transition. That's very much the obvious example here. That was not an easy transition, and in one gas board area, for example, homes needed to be visited 5 times, and it was also a stressful process for tradespeople involved, working to tight deadlines and under public scrutiny as well. But I would say that actually the UK is not alone in this. Other European countries such as France, Germany and Netherlands are facing similar sort of lack of skills required for the net zero transition. In Germany, for example, there's a lack of skilled workers in construction, electrics and engineering. So we're not alone in this. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And James Robson, please.
Thanks so much for having me here. I want to address this really from the perspective of education and training, which is where I come from. And the centre that I direct has really been looking at exactly these sorts of workforce issues for more than 2 decades. And so there's nothing necessarily particularly new here, I think, in the challenges. They're really tied to an intersecting set of issues that are entrenched in our education and training system, and that relates to chronic issues related to funding and lack of that, issues around who pays and who benefits within that system, issues with underinvestment from employers, the relationship between further education and higher education, the actual role that employers play within the education and training system, and actually the underpinning policy architecture around how the whole of the system is structured and managed. Now, there's lots, I think, that we can learn from history and from international contexts about this. I'll try and be very brief here as a sort of introduction, but I think probably our research has really shown that the way in which the education and training system is managed as a market has not succeeded. It's led to confusion, fragmentation, and low-quality offerings, which fundamentally shapes the skill supply for exactly the sorts of challenges that we're talking about here. And so really what we've emphasised is a need to shift that way in which the education and training system is run from competition to coordination, where the state plays a much greater role in actually managing the process of skill supply to meet demand. The second key point that I really want to emphasise here is that, again, our research has shown that tinkering on the skill supply side, so adapting curricula, looking at introducing more courses, just can't take place in isolation. You have to engage with the demand side issues as well and work directly with employers and broader industry on redesigning jobs, on ensuring that new work is properly resourced, properly structured, and that it's good as well, that the jobs that we're talking about are good jobs.
Thank you very much for those introductions. I'll come to the question of the comparison with the town gas transition, which two of you mentioned. Is there, do you have examples of how the workforce was trained to be able to do that work? Christian Calvillo, perhaps you can go first.
That was time before my time, so, but my understanding of this, how it happened, is that it was a bunch of policy changes that helped in this instance. It was like the post-war era when British Gas got nationalized and I think integrated quite a few separate companies into one. And that helped in the coordinating and managing and developing the skills at that scale. So that kind of more centralized approach helped in this instance, and that was kind of that big, let's say, as picking on the point that Professor Robson made, that this was less competition and more of a coordination effort here that helped in developing that.
Yeah, thanks. And Richard, Hanna, do you have anything additional from your research?
There's not anything I can add on the sort of workforce planning aspect of that. I've looked more at it as a kind of as a transition, as an energy transition, but not as in terms of workforce planning.
Okay, thank you. Mike Reader.
Hi. Interesting to hear you picking up town gas, and I recognise that there is something we need to learn from, but from reading the evidence we've had so far, we've got a real challenge of a smaller ageing workforce who are leaving the profession, and a much bigger challenge potentially of bringing new people into industry. So are there any other examples of in workforce transformation where we've had to bring in a lot of new people in industry rather than just doing a transition of existing workforce that you can think of, just to help us looking at other examples?
It's a difficult parallel to draw. I think I don't think I have a concrete example on mine, to be honest, unfortunately. Sorry. Okay.
Thank you very much. Are there any quick wins for the government in this the skills transition?
In my books, there are a couple of quick wins that are also low cost, and I think have been highlighted by colleagues, and I'm sure it will come back again in further questions. But this coordination across departments, better coordination across the whole nations as well, having a clear plan that is long-term, that goes beyond parliamentary terms and not changing policies, all that will help in drive confidence from the supply side, but also on the demand side, as Professor Robson was highlighting. So that coordination and level of policy certainty, that I think is a quick win.
Yes, please.
So I would probably push back on the idea of a quick win in this space. I think probably, and apologies for this, but probably research and experience has shown that focusing on quick wins here, and particularly workforce planning, often leads to quick failures, and that leads to a certain amount of soul searching and wound licking, which ultimately delays things. I think probably talking about big wins here is more effective and important, and I do think there is a really big opportunity here to actually shift the underpinning political architecture from competition to coordination, from market-based approaches to system-based approaches. That's not quick, but that's really big and important and impactful, I think.
You're arguing for a change in the way that the education system operates. Okay. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Absolutely.
Or quite a lot more about that?
So, I just dig deeper into what I started off saying. So, I think at the moment what we've had for probably the last 2 decades, in England at least, is a model where the idea of quality and skill supply has been based on the invisible hand of the market as the steer towards improving provision and making sure that there's an agile response to shifting skills demands. Actually, when we've analysed all of this and looked at all of this, not just me, but plenty of other researchers have done this and commentators have done this, you've seen that what tends to happen within this market-based system, where the state takes the regulator role rather than perhaps a more coordinating role, is a homogenisation of provision through competition, a fragmentation of the system, and actually a very confusing set of education and training pathways for both trainees and employers to navigate. Really, I think what we're seeing increasingly in Wales and Scotland is a shift to a much more coordinated and collaborative system where the relationship, for example, between higher education and further education is structured around a model of complementarity and collaboration, where there's a deliberate effort to work together rather than competition to meet the needs of the employer and of the individual. And that, I think, is probably where we need to get to and are beginning to get to in England, and we'll see how the post-16 education and training strategy emerges, which I think will start to push towards that shift in exactly that sort of underpinning political philosophy.
Yeah.
Do you have, as you've had Wales and Scotland taking that approach sooner, do you have evidence from that you could send us that would demonstrate the point you're making?
So we're beginning to do research. So in a project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, we're doing a cross-devolved nations analysis of post-16 education and training. The emerging findings definitely show that a more coordinated system is easier to navigate from the perspective of young people and learners, and enables employers to engage within that system in a much stronger and detailed way. I think things are still emerging in terms of the UK, but there's international evidence. Now, the sort of classic cases that are often held up for more coordinated systems are Germany, Singapore. New Zealand is actually moving towards, or has developed a quite coordinated tertiary system. Australia is moving in that direction too. I think the international evidence also points to a success around more coordination and collaboration between vocational and academic sectors. The issue, of course, in some of those examples is the fact that states like Singapore are really small. Scotland is smaller compared to England. That's why I think there's probably increasing interest in talking about coordinated systems at a regional level.
Thank you. Now, Richard Hanna, you wrote to us about the definition of green jobs. How well does the definition serve in meeting the government's plans and it's the demand for jobs that will follow?
So I think there's a number of different elements to this, but I think there's kind of the greenness, there's sort of green jobs and net zero jobs, and whichever definition is actually used needs to have a policy purpose. It's no good actually trying to measure something unless there's a policy behind it. So we can talk about net zero jobs, and it's certainly worth trying to have metrics on those because we have clear objectives in that space. And then there are kind of wider green job policy objectives, but also green jobs shouldn't just be measured in terms of a job being entirely green. They should be measured in terms of the extent to which a job actually is green. So metrics can actually be used to look at tasks and activities. So what proportion of a job's task is or activity components are actually green. And so existing...
Can you just say, give some examples of the sorts of jobs you're referring to?
So I mean, it could be. So it could be say a job in a renewable energy sector, but not all the jobs for a particular company is directly related to technology. It could be professional or IT jobs that are not in and of themselves green or low carbon.
Can I come in? Thank you very much. I think that's a very good point on the label of green jobs that we found also as part of a research and part of various projects, that people feel a bit anxious about the term green jobs and the label of green jobs because it feels that green job is only being on top of the wind farm and the wind turbines, and some of these, as Dr. Hanna highlighted, could be very much be green, but they're not labeled as that, or they're not considered as that, and that lots of people that could potentially do those jobs feel, oh, that's not for me because I work in a grey industry, so that's green, even though exactly the same thing, but that's not for me, so they kind of push back against that transition. So I think it's important to be careful with the term of green job and make it sure that it's more inclusive and also support diversity as well.
Thank you. Mike Reader.
Just for my clarity, because I don't know how the data is captured. So if you're a customer service team working for a clean energy provider, is that count as a green job? Is that how government is defining green jobs? Or does a green job become something where you're an engineer or a technical person doing something? How are you defining green jobs?
There are limited metrics in this space. So there's government's low carbon and renewable energy economy survey, which it does directly measure jobs in different renewable energy sectors like onshore wind or offshore wind, and so on. But then it doesn't really provide any granular detail beyond that. Are there jobs in the wider supply chain?
What's stopping having greater detail about what jobs are available and how they're defined?
I guess because the Office for National Statistics hasn't needed to do it in its standard occupational classification metrics, and until now, this granularity hasn't been required, and it requires quite a bit of work to actually go through the data and pull out the occupational codes that are green, I guess, if you like.
Yeah, and you suggested in your written evidence that we could learn from what happens in the United States. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's the ONET classification in the United States, which measures more sort of green tasks and activities and allows you to look at technical skills and softer non-technical skills as well. So that's a model that the UK could look to learn from.
Sure. Polly Billington.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in the definitions of green jobs for the purposes of understanding how we would use the data and what's the purpose of definitions. I'm particularly interested, for example, in how we encourage people into particular sectors. I'm also interested in how government might categorise jobs for the purposes of saying they've hit particular targets. That's not necessarily the same as actually managing to achieve what they need to achieve. So could we have a little bit of clarification from your perspective as to how you do that definition in order for those definitions to be functional and useful for government, administrators, decision makers, people trying to make decisions about what kind of job they might do, trainers, educators, employers, full works really.
Yeah, I mean, if we just take net zero jobs, so if we do have better metrics which are actually telling us the extent of jobs or maybe skills within jobs or tasks or activities that are related to net zero, then we can build a better picture of the extent of the workforce and perhaps where skills gaps might lie, and then that provides a basis to actually plan for, right, where are the gaps, where do we need to direct policy to address those gaps. That would be the idea of it.
Isn't that more to do with the skills than the job?
Well, it's both.
I mean, if you're a construction worker, you might, like you say, perceive yourself as being in a grey industry, but actually if you are skilled in order to be able to do retrofit, insulation, heat pump installation, etc., increasingly the proportions of your job that the functions that you discharge become increasingly green over time as you train, as you develop. I can't imagine that many 16, 17 and 18-year-olds in my patch are saying, I want to have a green job in construction. They're saying, I want to make sure that I'm earning enough money in order for me to be able to have a house and have a family. And if somebody says to them, you can do these, if you learn these things, then you will be able to do that, it matters less to them, but it matters to somebody.
It matters to the government as a central planner in order to make the net zero transition.
But also, sorry for following up on this, it might not matter to those 16, 17 and 18-year-olds, but we do know there are segments and demographics who are deeply excited about the possibility of doing a green job. How do they know that they're really doing a green job when actually what they really should be doing is insulating houses, not sitting at a laptop in Hackney? I mean, just for the shallowness of the comparison.
A quick one on that, because I think it's an excellent point, and we have heard that from stakeholders, and also at universities, my colleagues in geology, they're complaining that they have less people trying to do geology because they link that as a oil and gas sector job. Whereas there is a lot of green jobs within geology, like offshore wind and everything on subsurface elements, storage of CO2. There are lots of green jobs there, but it's important not to, maybe as you rightly say, focus too much on the label, because it's important for planning purposes, but more of trying to make it a synonym of a good job, which is also good for the planet if we want, but it's a good job for you to build a career on that. So it's a challenge, but we need to make sure that we sell the good message on that.
And can I just follow up a little bit, because I'm very interested in your idea about coordination and planning, particularly because some people have been arguing that we actually sort of need a kind of war footing in order to be able to achieve the energy security as well as the net zero achievements. But you're still working in a market with those 16, 17 and 18-year-olds. Can they do something else? As well as those people who say, no, I don't want to do that, it's dirty. So there is still a market element of this in terms of attracting people to do particular jobs. And I'm interested in how the definition or the characterisation of these jobs can help create the pathways into well-paid, good jobs that actually meet our targets without people ending up saying, why am I doing this? I'd rather do something else.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent point. And what this discussion has pointed to is just how challenging it is to define green jobs. This is an issue. I think the owner definition is very useful, but that highlights sort of three strands. We're talking about completely new jobs. We're talking about jobs that require new skills, and then we're talking about exactly those sorts of jobs that you've highlighted, where the envelope around them shifts and they become green. But the point, I think, here is that we probably need to shift the language from talking about jobs and green jobs to actually talking about careers. That's what matters. It's not filling these sort of short-term job holes to install a heat pump or whatever it may be. Actually, what matters in exactly that market of young people choosing careers is a career. It's something that's actually going to attract them for the longer term. And I think shifting the language around jobs to careers, shifting the focus to talking about the long term rather than the short term. And at the heart of, I think, a lot of the discussion here is an assumption that really we're talking about quick technological challenges, quick technological fixes, which has at the centre a sort of fit and forget mentality. So, you fit a heat pump, you do whatever it may be, and that's it, you move on. But that's just not attractive for a young person thinking about getting into a career in construction. And so actually you need to build into the discussion ways of talking about maintenance and ongoing tasks and work that are appealing, that fit into the idea of a good job, as Dr. Calvillo highlighted, that can be understood broadly for the individual and for the country. And that probably means fundamentally shifting the narrative at the policy level.
Right, we'll move on to. I've got one more question before I move on to Mike Reeder. We've many of the people who are potentially installing heat pumps they are now often installing gas boilers. The same point applies. They're sole traders or they're part of very small businesses. How do we get the data that's needed to address the points you've just been making without putting significant burdens on them? Which they have as a big concern about the whole approach to transition already.
So there's actually one way of actually measuring the sort of extent of net zero jobs or green jobs in this space is to actually automatically code job advertisements, and so that could be a way of an alternative to actually going out there and contacting SMEs with surveys and overburdening them. But actually Nesta have developed a database called the Open Jobs Observatory. It's a pilot, but they have used it as a preliminary way of detecting green job adverts. So that allows them to build up an idea of the distribution of green jobs in the UK. And as I say, it's a pilot, but it's something that could be extended more widely.
Thank you very much. Mike Reeder.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to talk a bit, or ask you some questions around career pathways, and it was quite interesting in looking at the early submissions we've had that there isn't a single common view. Some submissions have said that the existing workforce is actually enough to deliver transition and clean energy. Some have said that we should be focusing on new entrants because we have lots of retirements and obsolete skills. But there is an overwhelming majority that said that we need both. We need existing workforce and new entrants on well-structured career pathways. And Professor Robson, you gave us some very good evidence on that. So if I start with you, just could you set out for us, are career pathways in the clean energy sector clear, well-structured and resourced? And do they meet the needs of future new entrants and also the needs of the existing workforce?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And in a sense, I think I probably partially answered this already in my previous point. I think the answer is probably no. Simply no, there is a lack of clarity here. And that comes down to the muddy definitions around what these pathways are. I think probably what's actually required here is exactly what I said earlier on, is a demand-side set of interventions where work is done directly with employers and stakeholders to actually map out in detail what these sorts of career pathways might look at, taking a very broad view that captures both new kinds of work, and it's really easy to get sucked into just focusing on new kinds of work and technical skills associated with that. But we need to also talk about the ways in which existing roles are changing and the kinds of upskilling needs that are required. That requires, I think, really, really fine-grained analytical work that really brings in stakeholders and employers to actually collaborate to map out these decent careers.
I mean, on that, and to slightly kind of play devil's advocate, most suppliers, trade bodies would say they've already done that work, they've set that out, they've produced white papers, they've produced policy documents, they've told government what they need. They now need the skills and the people to deliver what they've told government. So where's that disconnect? Because industry, I hear, feels like they've done that work. They've said what they need, But you're saying perhaps that there is something still to do to close that gap.
So I think what this comes down to is a tendency, and I don't mean to appear too overly critical here of industry, but there's a tendency within employers to focus really overtly on short-term skills gaps for jobs that are needed now. And that's absolutely right and fine to emphasise that, and there's a need to fill those roles. But actually what I'm talking about here is a much longer-term view, which perhaps leads to some conflict between the short-term and the long-term, particularly in this net zero space, where the needs of the sector as a whole are aligned with the needs of the economy. And that means potentially some difficult conversations about what those jobs not just are, but should be in a kind of 5, 10, 15, 20-year horizon period. And that might mean some tensions and conflicts between perhaps a focus on the needs of the business and a focus on the needs of the economy and society.
That's really interesting, actually. So, short term, I guess government has Clear Power 2030, Clean Power 2030, and has been relatively clear with industry about what it looks looking for. But we heard in evidence last week that for emergent technologies and that longer term pipeline, still a lot of uncertainty. So and I ask this for others on the panel, do you think government needs to do more to set out that longer term vision towards 2050 particularly, and where we will go in terms of technology skills and the like, so that we can build those long term career pathways rather than just short term skills requirements?
Yes, briefly, yes, absolutely, I do. But I think it's also, there's a role for education and training to play in this too, and that means equipping people with the skills to navigate that uncertainty, and that is exactly what's I think been referenced already, those sort of employability skills, broader transferable skills that would enable that sort of ability to deal with uncertainty.
Yeah, so that's a quick point on that, but I completely agree. And we have heard that from our research and work talking to stakeholders in the industry, and they say that many new entrants to the market, they struggle to do it because they don't see, maybe they see a job for the next 5 years, but they don't know what happens after that, and that uncertainty really puts people off. So that long-term career pathway, and they have certainty in their job, that will go a long way.
Can I ask a question about the existing workforce? We've seen in evidence under the last government, adult learning dropped by nearly 50%. Yeah. Funding to adult learning was down at least 30% under the previous government. So what does this new government need to do in terms of practical steps to help prepare the existing workforce for the skills that we're likely to need?
Shall I take that one?
Go on.
So I think the issue with adult education is really critical. That has been underfunded and undervalued. And I think it's also led to intense inequalities in the workforce as well. You know, certain parts of the workforce are able to engage in ongoing continuing professional development, adult education, and others just simply don't have necessarily access to it, or it's not valued in their careers. So actually shifting that is really important, shifting the funding for that. There's, I think, probably questions around whether a loan-based model for continuing education, adult education, is completely the right way, whether that's actually going to overcome some of those embedded inequalities within the system. But I think there's also sort of broader issues around how you structure the whole underpinning approach. So I've talked about shifts from markets to systems as an approach. But there's maybe broader issues around the quality of provision that exists, that people are able to engage in, particularly in terms of reskilling. What I think does exist is something of a Wild West in that space, with very little oversight, really, or regulation of the quality of continuing professional development. I think there's a very clear role for government or perhaps Skills England to play in actually having oversight of that.
Is there sorry to interrupt, is there a desire amongst training providers to make the kind of changes you're very strongly advocating, do you think?
Yes, I think so. So I do quite a lot of work with the Association of Colleges, the AOC, I think there's a pretty strong desire, certainly for a shift towards a much more coordinated system and away from competition. We've done a lot of work with them, which has highlighted just the damage that has been done of the kind of current model that's left them underfunded and in competition for resources and young people, particularly with higher education. But I think there's also a desire for, I don't want to put words into their mouth, but I think broadly speaking within that space there's an interest in greater regulation and thinking about competency and minimum standards much more strongly.
Thank you. Mike Reader.
I just wondered if either you'd like to come in on that, or if not, I'll ask my final question.
Just a quick point on that, which I just echo the points made on that kind of consistency on the skills and the kind of quality of the skills is important, because we have that in higher education up to extents, like an engineer trained here in London will be just as good as an engineer in Scotland, but we might not have that same across vocational training. So I think that's important to make sure that we tackle this.
My final question, Professor Robson, I think you've kind of partly answered this already, so apologies for going over the same ground, but you talked about demand side, the need to redesign, but to what extent can we rely on employers and professional bodies alone to meet the training demand for what is a much larger, appropriately skilled workforce that we need?
So, I think this is an absolutely critical issue. It's a well-known and ongoing issue that employers in this country are underinvesting in ongoing education and training. We're now, as a country, I think investing in about half of what employers invest in Europe. This is really problematic, I think. And so the question really is probably not so much can we rely on them, but can we increase engagement from employers? And to do that, I think we need to unpack what are maybe the issues around why employers are not investing in and engaging appropriately in education and training. And I think there's a variety of reasons. It could be fear of poaching, competitors taking the workforce. There's maybe too much of an emphasis on low-skill business models, which is problematic. Broadly speaking, though, I think it comes down to the overall structure that we have, particularly in England, of our education and training system, which has, I think, increasingly positioned employers as outside the process of education and training. So although they're positioned as stakeholders, work has been done to put employers at the heart of the system, the actual active engagement in that has been limited. And so increasingly employers have been positioned as customers of a skills system with consumer rights, rather than actively engaged in doing that with probably responsibilities. And responsibilities can be understood in different ways. It could be financial responsibilities, but ideally, and we can learn from international comparisons here, those responsibilities involve much more active engagement in looking at skills demands, but also looking at the processes around skills formation, pedagogic approaches. All of these things are absolutely critical, and you can't do that if essentially you've pushed the employer bodies too far out of that system. So actually what we need to do, I think critically, is bring in more partnership. Really find structures, policy structures, to bring in better partnership working between employers and the industry. Right.
Just to follow that up, is there a way of incentivising employers to want to increase their involvement in training?
Good start. I think that's sort of a really wicked problem, actually. I don't have any easy answers for that. If I did, I think...
We'd be doing it.
But I do think it comes down to the structures that you have at play. So actually creating spaces and opportunities for proper partnership working. And that probably means having functioning bodies. So IFATE was part of that previously. But there may be questions around whether they're able to engage properly with a large enough body of employers. So the question now is really, will Skills England be able to take on that role in an effective way? I think that's where the questions really need to be asked and answered.
That's helpful. Do either of you have anything to add?
There is one idea around shared apprenticeship schemes where companies basically co-own and co-fund apprentices could be a potential model.
I agree on that one. I think copying a little bit also the models in Germany and other parts where there is basically an interest from the companies to develop their own workforce to the level they want them and to the quality they need, helps them to actually deliver then their own economic services and products. A good example that comes to mind is what Octopus is doing now. They're trying to basically do the whole supply chain themselves. And you could argue they're doing some good progress on that. So kind of having that policy certainty that there will be demand for this, then the companies will like to invest in developing the workforce that can help deliver their products to market.
Can I just follow up on this idea about getting the employers involved? One sort of stakeholder in this or mover in this space are local authorities, who are both providers of jobs and commissioners of further education. Could they be one of those lead anchor employers who might say, we are committed for the next 10, 20, 30 years to transform the fabric of the assets that we own, and we will need X amount of workforce to do that, and therefore we will employ those people if you train them? Is that something that could be done in order to be able to kind of kickstart a pipeline of trained people who would, at least for a short period of time, possibly longer, be employed by that local authority and then be able to enter the job market for other employers?
I start that one. I would say absolutely. And I think that goes back to some of the previous points I already mentioned, that we need a big driver of demand here, because if we leave it to the market, it hasn't happened. So if that local authority can be the big anchor demand that...
Why hasn't that happened?
That's a good question. I think there was probably more need from up top, drive down the message and say, forget about everything else. We really need to go full in on heat decarbonization, energy efficiency. Here's the funding. Do it quickly. I think that will help in this instance.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can all agree to have a well-trained workforce is in all our benefit. I sometimes worry that maybe employers feel that you spend all your time and investment into a person and then they move on to other things, and that's probably where a bit of the looking at the interest of an employer, what do you get out of it, and for your long-term retention of your staff is probably a sort of buy-in thing that we need from employers. But my set of questions goes around the required skills level and occupational barriers to access. And Professor Robson, I'm going to ask you first again. How do the levels of competence mandated in legislation vary for the workforces likely to be involved in Clean Energy 2030 as against decarbonising buildings?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, I think there's clearly more emphasis and legislation around competence in clean energy. The issue I think that we really have here, or a very significant issue, is that the buildings workforce has largely operated in a sort of laissez-faire world, right? And so actually I think that there probably is a real need to raise minimum competencies there, that there is a need for regulation that's much more coordinated to ensure that those two are more closely aligned, that they shouldn't be different, that there is a good overlap. So actually raising those minimum competencies in buildings construction is absolutely critical. I think it's really important to talk about competence here. So it's easy to talk about just skills, but actually competence is critical. When we talk about skills, we're really talking about the ability to do a task, to do something. But when we're talking about competence, we're talking about the effective use of skills, knowledge, experience to do something in the real world, on the ground, in homes, whatever it may be. And so actually unpacking that and raising minimum standards for those sorts of competencies, I think is really key in the construction space.
And could you give an example, maybe a sort of real-life example, since we are talking about real-life competencies?
Yeah, so let's talk about somebody working on a building site. And actually, if you're talking about, the ability to install a door frame is a skill, right? That's an important skill. But if you're talking about a set of minimum net zero related competencies, you actually need to understand the supply chain around wood. You need to understand how that piece of work fits into the overall site and the work of colleagues, how your waste gets disposed on that site. That's the sort of thing that I'm talking about, that actually having a much more broader understanding as a minimum level of how a piece of work and a skill fits into the overall sort of system, professional, occupational system that you're working in. I think that's exactly what we're kind of getting at.
Thank you. Anyone wants to add to that? No?
Just briefly on that, I think having that greater understanding of the system could also help you do that transferability of skills. You could be able to apply those examples to other sectors a little bit easier. You have that bigger understanding as well.
Or transferable skills?
Yes.
Thank you. My next question, how might a balance be struck between regulating high standards and competencies and ensuring the jobs market is accessible and able to fill skills shortages in time?
So I'll start. So I don't think there needs to be a sort of zero-sum game between those two things, between high standards and competencies and skill shortages. I think probably the issue here is a need to reframe our assumptions about education and training and how that should work. So look, I think a kind of market-based approach has led to an unresponsive system. I've been reasonably clear about that. And so I don't want to repeat that. But I think the point about a more coordinated system is that if you're able to have more government intervention and clearer work with employers, then you can engage in longer term planning to at least partially mitigate those those sort of immediate short-term shortages. So you've planned for a set of changes much more overtly. So there's less risk of that. But there's better horizon scanning as well if you're working more closely with employers, and so changes in the labour market can be planned for. But critically, I think in a more coordinated and collaborative system, what you hopefully will achieve is a workforce with more transferable skills. So they're able to sort of actually apply a broad base level of competency, skills, whatever it may be, to a shifting set of demands. And so you actually can alleviate some of those pressures that come up with sort of short-term demands as things change, as new technologies evolve, if you've got that sort of base level of transferable skills.
And my next question really leads then into that. Is there a scope for improving the framework of relevant bodies so it is clearer to workers and consumers who is responsible, accountable for training, accreditation and delivery? Would that also be part of that sort of bigger system thinking?
Well, I think so. I personally think there's an urgent need for this, and our research has argued for this. I think it's worth here differentiating between sort of initial education and training and ongoing professional development. We've touched on this a little already, and I think particularly the CPD, the continuing professional development world, is, as I've said, a wild west, and it's really mixed quality of providers, provisions. There's commercial interest, people delivering different sorts of.
Oh yeah, we know we had a session on retrofits, didn't we? So
yeah, and so it ranges from everything from somebody trying to sell a product and attaching a program of education and training to that, to having a briefing and a bacon bap. There's just this massive mix of quality there, and so actually having something that sits over that and tries to think about the quality, not just the quantity of provision, is absolutely clear. I think it's this messy space, particularly, I keep talking about construction here because I think it is particularly messy. If we compare that to something like an MOT, there you've got something that's very simple. You've got a framework, one body, one system that's really easy to navigate from a consumer point of view. But the construction industry, if you're actually interested in learning something, you've got to navigate a whole range of things. If you're a consumer trying to employ a provider, employ a construction worker, working out who's qualified with what those qualifications mean is incredibly challenging. So actually having something that sits over the top of that and provides clarity, one framework, one system, one body that makes sense, I think.
Is there an organisation that you think should do it that exists now?
Well, I don't think there is an organisation that exists now that might be able to do that. I think that I keep referring to Skills England. There's a lot of hopes and dreams resting in Skills England.
You're giving this to Skills England as well, aren't you?
Yes, I was thinking skills.
Put it in that direction and see what happens.
Right. Thank you very much. Local Crichton.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all for coming in and giving your evidence. And just to pick up on that point, Professor Robson, you talked about, quick wins becoming quick losses, but surely a simple win is that coordination you're talking about, and is that body you're talking about, perhaps not Skills England, because remember we're talking about Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland. Could that just be the Office for Clean Energy Jobs, that it should play a UK-wide role in making sure these skills are the same across all the nations? And also, can I ask you to address the feasibility of taking these skills from England to go and work in the north of Scotland, or to come from Northern Ireland to go across to Wales?
Yeah, so devolution, I think, is really, really important here, as is regionalisation. And so portability of skills is I think, a real challenge. So just in relation to the Office for Clean Jobs, I think that critically how that interfaces with Skills England is important, how that interfaces with Scottish Funding Council and MEDIR in Wales is absolutely essential as well. And so while I think that is a big win, I don't think it's a simple win. I think there's a lot of challenges to think through actually how you do that coordination, but I think it should be done and pushed for. In terms of portability of competencies working across different devolved nations, there are clearly challenges associated for that, and that's why I think having a much stronger coordination role for those governments, and actually England catching up with Wales and Scotland, is absolutely essential.
You anticipate my next question. Are the requirements that different between different nations?
I don't think I could answer that in depth, probably enough.
Anyone else help me with that?
I'm also not an expert on building regulations, for example. I know there are differences, and there are specific, also geographical challenges that apply, but I will argue that the same basic skills that you need will be applied for someone working in the south of England and going to Scotland.
Mm-hmm. There are differences, though. I mean, it's 13 degrees and sunny outside just now. Where I come from, the wind is blowing 52 miles an hour just now from the southwest. The houses are heated by fuel oil or peat. An air source pump just isn't going to cut it, And while there's kind of uniform regulation for products and technical safety across the whole of the UK, is there a need for flex to take into account the geography and the different climates across?
I think that's a very good point. I had a discussion with a colleague that works on heat pumps as well. The basic approach you should take is the same, that you still need to analyze your property, see what is built, what is the general environment, do your heat losses assessments, your assessment on the different technologies, size it properly. So you change your coefficients, you change your parameters to get to the right system for you. But I think you in my opinion, should have the right skills and the right accreditation to say, I can do it just as easily here than in Scotland. Of course, the system will be different, but my capability as a professional in this area can help deliver.
Okay.
Can I follow up on that? I don't think I agree.
Okay.
On the basis that people become specialists in typologies of housing, for example, based on their experience, and quite often they are in places. So the experience of Torquil's constituents will be very different from mine, even if we're both in coastal communities, because our homes were built at different times with different kinds of fabric. And much as we want a base standard for everybody who is doing that stuff, we also will want people who are going, now I know how to do that because I did that down the road. Whereas if you expect it all to be exactly the same everywhere, we have seen where rollout has had some significant failings because there is not that knowledge and understanding of place.
I completely agree, and I didn't mean to say we implement everything the same. It's not quite the same. I'm meaning that the process of you building a system and designing the system, the skills that you need to do that, like as an engineer working in here or you're working in London, the skills are similar, you apply it differently, if that makes sense. So the solution should be tailored to the specific needs to the place, but you as a professional should know what applies here and what applies in Scotland, if that makes sense.
I mean, anecdotally, Chair, and for you, Dr. Calvillo, we find in Scotland, even within Scotland, one size does not fit all.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And you have the difference on oil, access to the gas network, etc. More drafty, more wind. It will be different. And I have done some work in the Scottish Isles, for example, and they have huge levels of fuel poverty, very old housing stock, very not great building qualifications over there. And it talks back to the point that Professor Robson made before, that low skilled type, I always do the same everywhere I go. It doesn't matter what the property is. That is the danger that we can have here. And of course, that's not what we're trying to argue here, but the opposite. Train well, trade once, and you can do it everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, that's me. Except to make that point again about whether there should be a UK-wide coordination through the Office of Clean Energy Jobs. Dr. Hanna, any thoughts?
I mean, I think the Office for Clean Energy Jobs is slightly unfortunately named and linked to the Clean Power Mission, which means that by name it doesn't sound as holistic as it should be, and it should be about making the net zero transition across electricity, heat, industry, transport, decarbonisation. But certainly it has that overview. But I think it might not necessarily, it could be managed by the Office for Clean Energy Jobs, but I think there's potentially some need here for a UK-wide competency framework or national occupational framework which has defined minimum standards for certain occupations but with potential to build in place-based flexibility.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a very good topic for the Minister when they come and give their evidence at the end of this inquiry, I think. Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming and giving evidence to us. I am going to just go into a bit more about the supporting workers transitioning from high carbon sectors. So some of this you've touched on your evidence like previously in this session. But given the complexities of industrial transitions that you've all touched upon in this session, do you think it's realistic to expect a direct large-scale transfer of jobs from one sector into another? And going on from that, how should policymakers address those challenges of workforce displacement when industries wind down? And Dr. Hanna, if you could address that first, please.
Yeah, I can start on that. The first thing to say is that there is quite high potential in terms of transferable skills from the oil and gas industry to other sectors, such as offshore wind or CCS or hydrogen renewables. So some examples would be, expertise in geological modelling related to subsurface and reservoir exploration could potentially be used in sort of carbon capture and storage or hydrogen storage, geothermal energy. Another example would be sort of offshore oil platform experience translates well to floating wind potentially. and then obviously there's, in the oil and gas industry, there's extensive drilling and well management experience that translates well to geothermal energy, carbon dioxide injection, and so on. So those are a few examples, and I think there's a lot of transferability there, potential, but then in terms of actually making that transition, I think we as policymakers need to do better in terms of building closer links between sectors which are at risk of losing jobs and sectors which are going to be bringing people
just
in.
Going on from that, so recent experiences in Port Talbot and in Grangemouth suggest that redundancy is often more likely than for redeployment is. So do you think we've sufficiently planned for this transition? What are the challenges around that? And in reality, what does a just transition actually mean? And where is the just when you look at communities like that?
Yeah, there's a point going back to metrics as well, which I didn't mention, which is that we need to be measuring jobs at risk and new opportunities at a regional and local level as much as is possible, so that can aid workforce planning. But then there needs to be a whole range of measures around sort of labour market planning and regulation. So, there's considerations around company transition plans. So, so requirements for employers to provide sufficient termination packages or early dismissal notices, and then in Sweden there's an example of job security councils which actually undertake collective bargaining agreements to provide early access to reskilling opportunities for workers. But that also would benefit from these sort of closer links between sort of the incoming industries and the outgoing industries. But there's kind of separate issues around, in the oil and gas sector, some jobs are very well paid, and that can be a disincentive from making the shift across. And another point is that some contractors, they might move from high carbon sectors to low carbon sectors and back to high carbon sectors. So it's not necessarily a one directional thing.
We've had, and then I'll open it up to all of you because I'm interested to hear your answers, but we've had the GMB here who obviously represent the sector with their members, and they've raised the issue of wages, but also have said that they've called for funding which might include direct grants, tax incentives or transitional wage funds that support older workers in particular in that carbon intensive sectors to retrain. So just would like your thoughts on that and the other questions that have gone previously, Dr. Calvillo and Professor Robson. You'd like to?
Yeah, I think those are very good points, and I agree with Dr. Hanna's points there, that there are not all oil and gas sectors will need transitioning. People working in an oil rig right now very easily just go and work in an oil rig in the Middle East, for example, and they might not want to transition. So I think that's a fact, unfortunately. One of these reasons is, of course, the high salaries, and then we are going to be using oil and gas for a while still here in the UK and across the world. So there will be demand for highly skilled people, very specialized people on that. There will be other parts around the supply chains that should be easier transition, as Dr. Hanna highlighted, on the offshore sector, for example, on the industrial decarbonization sector, transport and storage of CO2, for example. And there are opportunities there also as a new export market, for example. And we have done work on that, analyzing that potential for bringing in emissions from Europe, for example, and provide that as a service and can bring a new way of economic development there. There will be others around the kind of the more indirect elements that will require some support, definitely. The caterers, the people that work around the supply chain that not directly on oil and gas, but support the workers that work in oil and gas. And that we need to look at after that. And as Dr. Hanna mentioned, see what's coming after and try to match the two things together.
Professor Robson.
Thank you. I don't have a great deal more to add. I fully agree with everything that's been said. I think the only thing that I would just put in is that when talking about transition, this word just that you've highlighted is critical. And it's really easy to talk in sort of macro terms and actually forget the individuals involved in transition, and that there's a whole range of social and cultural issues around work and the kind of work that people want to do which need to be discussed and factored in. And actually we need to talk about the agency of individual workers here too, and empower people to navigate that space in a way that they want to and need to.
How do you bring that in? How would you do that?
So I think in terms of policy discourse, I think just ensure that stakeholder voices are included in discussions. But in terms of, from an education and training perspective, I think giving people transferable skills, talking about education and training pathways, reskilling pathways that give people more opportunities than perhaps sit at that macro level, X is going to go into Y, that give individuals agency to choose what sorts of roles that they might want to take on.
It's just the reality of that though, because a lot of times the individual in those workplaces will feel like things are being done to them rather than they are part of it. So, and they're not going to see any agency in going in and representing themselves. So, yeah, in reality, what does that look like and how realistic is it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a strong believer in empowering individuals, and so I think that maybe means government holding employers to account more to ensure that individual workers are not left behind and aren't feeling that stuff is being done to them. But beyond that, I probably wouldn't want to get into too much more depth.
And just finally, you raised earlier, Dr. Calvillo, I think it was you, not losing out to offshore competition, and we face challenges in manufacturing, infrastructure, supply chain readiness, skill shortages. So what steps should be taken to ensure that the economic benefits that are possible of the 2025 to 2030 clean power projects remain here?
That's a very good question. We need to do a lot of things, I guess. Having that policy certainty on the change happening, I think that will go a long way, in the sense that people that feel they can transition safely, that there will be a career for them and there will be good paid jobs, secure in the long term, and the new entrance to the market the same. Because I guess going to that point of those communities, there is that sense of identity as well. Like if you are from Aberdeen and you always work on oil and gas and your dad did the same and your granddad did the same, it's very difficult to break that cycle. So we need to start early and look at it in a more positive light and saying a green job is a good job, it's coming, it's good for us, let's embrace it, instead of oof, we're not sure what's going to happen in 5-10 years' time. So I think that goes a long way, just having that certainty, bringing people together in a good messaging, I think that will help massively. And again, offshoring, we need to be very careful about that, because we can lose all of those skills that we have developed over the last few decades on offshore, for example, on renewables, on oil and gas, like as Dr. Hanna said, all the drilling and the subsurface geology, all those are very valuable skills, very high skilled people there that we don't want to lose, because there is also greater global competition now, and there is a very good chance that these people can go to the US, for example, if there is a better job option there.
Do any of the rest of the panel want to come in here?
How well are we doing in delivering the policy certainty that you referred to there, Christian Calvillo?
Not great. I think it's getting better, if I may. But the constant moving the goalpost of, oh, we're banning gas boilers from this date and then not this date and this is a different date, and the Green New Deals, when they come and they last for a little bit and the grants ends, and these type of changes are very damaging to the sectors to kind of make informed decisions on how to invest, and also for householders make a decision. Okay, I'm going to invest this because it's good long term. But there are also positives there. I guess the good positive here is electric vehicles. Of course, they were not there yet, but it seems that now all the effort that happened before has gone to a place that now is a little bit more self-sustained, that there is less government intervention needed. Manufacturers are developing more electric cars, they're selling more electric cars, people are buying more electric cars. People that have them, they love them. My father-in-law has one, fully converting everyone he knows. So there are good stories there, but the more certain than we can do, the better.
Thank you, that's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I felt we were going back to your opening answer about the 1960s transition and that if it worked then, it can work now. But
yeah.
Just one other question before I move on to Torval Crichton again. Robert Gordon University have quoted a figure of 90% of medium to high skills transferability. What's a realistic figure that we could expect for workers in oil and gas to actually transfer? Christian Calvillo, you were talking about they have other options in oil and gas elsewhere in the world. What's realistic?
That's an interesting, and I guess goes back to other points made before. There is a potential for many of these skills to be transferable. How quickly that can be delivered, that's maybe a little bit more of an unknown, because people, even though it's the same potential skills, they might need to retrain and upskill a little bit as well. And I guess a bigger point there that probably worth highlighting as well is we shouldn't bank on the oil and gas sector workforce to help deliver net zero necessarily, because of the scale is not quite there. Like, there is lots of people working in oil and gas, of course, but maybe not enough to deliver net zero. And the other one is the timelines don't really match. Like, the sector is declining slowly, but still declining. So there will be freed up capacity from the workforce, but not to the scale and to the timelines we need. And we have done some work on that. We looked at, as part of our industrial decarbonization work, how oil and gas transitioning to CCUS, for example, can help ease the workforce constraints, but because of the timelines, it's quite limited, the effect that you get.
Yeah, James Robson, do you have a percentage that you want to give?
I would not commit to a percentage, I think, at this stage.
All right, or Richard Hanna.
No, I don't have a percentage, but I know that the International Energy Agency have done analysis on this actually in terms of likely displaced oil and gas workers and likely transferable workers, but I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head.
Thank you. Ollie Billington.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on one of the questions from my colleague Annalise about the skills transfer, and you mentioned about the skills transfer between the oil and gas industry and renewables and so forth. What we have learned from other evidence that we've taken in other places and so forth is that although the skills might be transferable, the jobs are less well paid in the renewables industry from the oil and gas industry, even though the oil and gas industry is declining, the renewables industry is expanding, and demand should be up, therefore pay should be up. Can you explain a little bit what you understand are the drivers behind this disparity and what can be done to tackle it?
That's a very good question, a very good point, and I have heard the same from people working in the industry. I think if you look at the average is higher, definitely, but there is a subset of those jobs that are extremely well paid that kind of drive the average up. Those people, I don't think they will transition. As we said, they're probably just going to go find a job somewhere else. I think that
even, sorry to interrupt, this is even jobs that are comparable.
Yeah.
They are being paid less in the renewables industry, even though they have similar skills, and similar skills are required to what they do in the oil and gas industry. So it's not just the average, it's the specific.
Yeah, no, and that's a very good point. And I guess going to the previous point mentioned before, we cannot force anyone. If people can still want to work in the industry because it pays more and they can find a job somewhere else that can help that, I think that's fair enough.
But forgive me, I know we're talking to people who, generally speaking, believe in central planning and coordination and so forth. But it does strike me, as somebody who has some kind of understanding of how the market works, that if it is a growing industry and they're short of people to do stuff, why aren't they having to pay people more in order to be able to match what they
Yes.
are paid in a dying industry.
That is also a very good point, and actually it talks to a bigger problem of the constrained labor market. The more of that labor market being constrained, like there is not enough people to do the jobs, basically, then higher you need to pay them. And for example, if you want to bring people from oil and gas to work in renewables, you need to match those salaries. Mm-hmm. The problem with it as well is that brings the salaries of everyone's up and will make the cost of delivering higher.
I can't believe that the people who are doing or making renewable energy are thinking so much about the cost of the consumer that they are keeping the pay low, in which it might be reducing their ability to be able to recruit the skills they need in order to be able to generate the energy.
No, and that's true. But most of the costs on the renewables, for example, will come from the CFDs. So the CFDs will set the general project price and the returns on that, and I completely get that. And I guess we got an example of if the price is not high enough, the projects don't go ahead, and we got around, it was last year, that they got no takers because the price was not quite to what the project developers needed. The more that constrained labor comes into play, like the less people there is to actually deliver, and as we are ramping up now, there's going to be more and more shortages, the price will continue to creep up. And it could be that point that you will get the same salaries from someone in oil and gas to
We're just
renewables.
hoping that the market's going to work.
Well, we're hoping that we can do something about the skill shortages so we don't get to that point. Because otherwise, you will pay it on your energy bills. The price will go up on everything net zero. And
Thank
not
you.
only...
We'll move on. That's fine. Thank you. Thanks very much. Talk Crichton.
Thank you, Chair. Kind of following on that in one sense, instead of talking about skills transfer, or actually talking about physical transfer of people across the country. Christian, I'm sure you're aware of already, to strengthen the grid in Skye, there's talk of a work camp for 350 people. To get the interconnector across to the Western Isles, we'll need to build housing for 300 other people, hopefully legacy housing in that case. Are we going to see a lot more of that across the UK in time to come?
Yes, I think so. Especially as you rightly highlighted, lots of the renewables that we'll see in the UK will be in the northern parts of the country, where it's less housing available, and the locals are struggling for housing as it is, and it will get worse. So I think that's something that, again, will probably make cost of labor higher, because those need to be considered as well.
Dr. Hanna, in delivering clean energy by 2030, decarbonising by 2050, can we do it alone? Can we do it with British jobs or British workers, or will we have to go into the international market?
So I think that we probably, I mean, in all likelihood, we probably can't do it completely on our own. But I think there's good potential that where we can source local labour, we should be. So things like renewables construction, or heat pump installers, retrofit installers, maintenance engineers. I think we should be trying to source those jobs locally, but obviously market economics will dictate that it will be difficult for us to set up extensive manufacturing bases in different renewables technologies, for example heat pumps, although there are at least several manufacturers now in the UK. So yeah, I think that we do need to source some of that labour overseas. And
it's been put to us that the existing immigration skills charges could be redirected into domestic training. Is that feasible, or are there other mechanisms the government could use to offset the lack of skills we have in the country?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of initiatives in the EU. So one is kind of like a shared talent pool of workers. So the European Commission has actually initiated this, and the idea is that it's actually providing a sort of database of adverts or details about candidates who are looking to move to specific low carbon jobs in particular countries in the EC, or in the EU. So therefore, that is something that maybe the UK could look at drawing upon.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask if anyone knows where these workers may come from? Where will the welders come from? Where will the heating engineers come from? Is there a specific geographical part of the world where we have an abundance in these sectors? No.
It's something I want to do in a new research project I'll be looking at. I don't have the information yet, but watch this space.
Okay, you can write to us about it if you like. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Polly Billington.
Thank you. Now, we've talked a little bit about this. New technologies arise. Costs can go up and down. Sometimes policies fail. And governments, dare I say it, do change. So how much policy certainty can be expected given the 2030 and 2050 timeframes? Expected, not wanted. What can you expect?
That's a good question. I think we're now in a better position than we were maybe 5-10 years ago, in the sense that we have a clearer roadmap of where we need to go. Like, we know that electrification will be key on all this. So for that, we need lots of more renewables. For that, we'll need to heat pumps. We also need to electric vehicles and everything that goes around it, networks, etc. I think there is less questions around that, at least till 2050. For that reason, I think there is less chances that things change massively. But in the detail is what we probably want to be as certain as possible, because that will drive the investment, certainty, policy certainty, including in addition to investment from the government, gives the certainty to investors, private investors, to also chip in and develop their workforce and develop the requirement changes.
We need that sector certainty. We need the certainty at sector level and also at technology level. I mean, we've seen the switch back on, for example, home heating, which has meant that we don't have a supply chain, we don't have consistency of uptake and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think earlier discussions about is it going to be hydrogen, is it going to be heat pump, is it going to be this, is it going to be that, wasn't helpful because of that delay. People, big industry, energy companies, didn't want to invest on a potential technology that is not going to be used. I think we have moved on to that, thankfully, so I think we can move forward and have a little bit more certainty on that. Still, the demand needs to be there, meaning people need to want to take the heat pumps, and that's where also the policy certainty will have a big role to play.
Thank you. And Professor Robson, are there any downsides to having stricter standards or requirements through publicly procured work compared to the rest of the market?
So I think this is a fascinating question. I think it sort of links maybe with your previous point about local authorities playing a role too, whether that can kickstart demand. But I guess the issue here is whether the top end of the system in terms of standards can pull up the bottom end. And the answer that I have is that I don't know. I would actually probably want to do quite a lot more modelling on that to see if it's likely to work. There's some evidence internationally that it would do, but there's also evidence around potential perverse consequences of relying too much on public procurement as a way of changing the system. I think there's potential risk of a two-tier system here. And so in order to actually change the whole of the workforce, you might be able to shift the top end with public procurement interventions, but you have to have some kind of regulatory mechanisms to change the bottom.
You've got to have a high standard, but you've got to have you've got to have a floor.
You've got to have a floor, exactly. Yeah, so I think that's critical. So in my view, more modelling is needed, but it almost certainly can't be done in isolation.
You said there was some evidence internationally. Which countries?
I'll have to check that from my files and come back to you if that's okay.
I mean, there is historically evidence of what the impacts are of having higher standards in public procurement, aren't there?
I'm not aware of that. So
well, I'm just thinking of direct labour organisations, the skills that are required in order to be able to be hired by the local authority, dare I say it, at a time when local authorities used to hire people to do stuff on the assets that they owned, for example. So I was just interested to see, in that context, whether we have explored and understood what the downsides of that would be, because, as I say, I'm aware of how people can sometimes, a bit like the town gas thing, we can get a little bit misty-eyed about how things happened in the past. And I was interested, Dr. Hanna, in your brief summary of some of the challenges for the workers in that transition. So I wouldn't like us to make recommendations which suggested that we needed to return to some halcyon days when there were high standards of training and so forth for employees of local direct labour organisations and everybody else just lifted accordingly. So I want to understand a little bit about what we know historically as well as in terms of international comparisons. Is there such work?
I mean, if others want to come in on this, might be, but I'm aware of some work. Colleagues of mine in SKOPE have done sort of historical analysis, particularly funded by the Edge Foundation. Have done a sort of package of these things. I don't have that at the top of my mind to bring into.
You might be able to provide it for us.
I can certainly dig that out for you.
Lovely, that would be really helpful. Yeah. Dr. Calvillo, how might any tensions be overcome between increasing obligations in public procurement on the one hand and opening up access to procurement of SMEs on the other?
I think that, as with all things in life, you need to strike a good balance between the two. Like, you will probably need some sort of government procurement, but also allow for the SMEs to play a role. And I think that probably that balance will be different depending on the sectors, and probably will also be different depending on separate locations, where maybe in certain areas, maybe more rural, more remote areas, the SMEs take a bigger role than in not. So it's difficult to know for a fact, but for example, we have my colleagues in the Energy Demand Research Centre done work on SMEs and procurement around that. And I guess what was happening before, it was probably too much reliance on SMEs to take everything. So I think we probably need to be careful on that as well.
Where have you found evidence that there's been too much reliance on SMEs?
On the low carbon heat, for example, the training for new entrants to the market on low carbon heat, on heat pump installation, etc. Up to recently, and I know this from my colleagues in the Skills Development Scotland, they're saying that the basic realistic route to market for new entrants to that workforce will be SMEs taking an apprenticeship. But of course, the numbers are more limited on what they can actually take, maybe one at a time, things like that. So there was more of that evidence at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Young.
Thank you. So I want to talk about one of the other themes that came through in the written evidence, which is about consumer demand then driving increased labour demand. And there was some concern that members of the current workforce feel they don't need to retrain because there'll be plenty of work doing what they're doing at the moment. So I think this was for Professor Robson, how might the government avoid any regulatory push requirements placing too high a cost burden on consumers?
Yeah, I mean, the issue that you've raised is really important in terms of an apparent lack of demand, meaning that workers don't want to retrain. So our work has got loads of interviews with gas boiler fitters, for example, saying that there's just absolutely no reason to even look at heat pump training because they feel they've got enough work to take them all the way up to retirement. And so there's this sense that if we can just change that consumer behaviour, can change demand, then we can change the sort of approaches within the workforce to retrain and engage in greener technologies and installations and those sorts of issues. And I think it is easy to sort of think about, well, are there initiatives that can be introduced, whether that's sort of financial incentives, maybe sort of grants for heat pumps, whatever it may be, to try and change that consumer behaviour. But I think there's another way of looking at this, which is actually it's often the workers who have an enormous impact on exactly the choices that consumers make. So actually, it's the gas boiler fitter who will say, why didn't you go with the Valent? Or because I know them and so on. And as a consumer, why would you go with somebody else? Why would you push back against the person who's going to do the work and risk that. So actually thinking about that dynamic is really important. And this actually, it feels like a vicious cycle, right? That what do you change? Is it chicken and egg, consumer demand, blah, blah, blah. And that's, I think, a really problematic issue. And perhaps it's not surprising that the person coming from education and training should say, well, maybe the solution is around education and training. But I think it does have a role to play, that actually if we could get the education and training right, the offers right for people to reskill and think more broadly about what it is that they're skilling into and for, then actually maybe have a way of changing that workforce and changing that consumer demand and starting to shift that vicious cycle into a virtuous circle. Yeah. And so by thinking about the education and training, I think what we're really coming back to is talking not just about short-term skills to install a boiler or whatever it may be, but actually longer-term career choices. So shifting again from that sort of fit and forget mentality to a longer-term maintenance relationship with a consumer around a piece of greener technology and crafting a good career around that.
Annalise Smidgley, before I come back to Clay.
Just going on to that, and it relates to what we were talking about before. We've had evidence here previously that, as well as what you've raised, gas boiler fitters are paid about 10 grand more than heat pump fitters. Also, for them to be trained, they will lose thousands of pounds in terms of loss of earning, and the grant isn't enough to cover it. Also, very few people know what heat pumps are yet. They're not all clamouring to get one. So where is all of this incentive? Like, how is this imposed on reality? Where are these incentives for those people to retrain when the balance of scales is like this in terms of them staying in their old jobs, fitting and maintaining the gas boilers?
I mean, you're exactly right. There needs to be a fundamental shift in the recompense associated with that. And that needs to be driven, I think. If it's clear, I think that the market isn't ensuring that those wages are met by the needs of society, and so there needs to be some kind of intervention to actually push that, to reshape that, and there needs to be a shift in the narrative around this. That has an impact on the consumer and on the supplier as well.
Can I add a quick point on that? Because also having had similar experience talking with gas engineers and also with heat pump practitioners, they said lots of the challenge here is that they lose lots of time on talking to the client before actually doing any job, and then after on the commissioner's phase, because as you say, people don't know about them, don't know how to operate, they work differently, so they're a bit unsure, they need more hand holding, and that takes quite a long time. So that role of the energy advisor, the energy planner, that is probably less sexy relative to the heat pump installer or the more kind of high-line jobs, is very important, and we need more people like that can help people reduce that time, the commissioning, pre-commissioning, and make the thing more swiftly, because that will reduce the cost of installations and increase the margins for the installers as well.
If I can come back to, because I think what you're doing is challenging the basic premise of my question, because the question was, so the evidence is saying if we increase consumer demand, that will increase the labour demand, and so the premise then is that, you know, all the questions are around the various things you could do. So I mean, this question was around the government doing something in terms of regulation to push people. So, for example, you could extend the requirements from new build to existing owner-occupied homes or privately rented or whatever that would require. So you'd have regulatory push which would then create consumer demand. But are you suggesting that that's the wrong way to go about it? So we don't need to worry about the high cost burden on consumers that would then represent, because you don't think it's the right thing to do in the first place?
So Yeah, sorry, typical Oxford professor challenging the question, and I'm going to do it again. And it's really, I think, a point that I'm not convinced the evidence is actually saying that if you solely raise consumer demand, you've solved the problem. I think what the evidence that I've seen, that the work that I've done at least, suggests that one of the reasons that the behaviour of suppliers is not changing is because the consumer demand isn't there. But that's not it's not necessarily a case that, look, if you give consumers incentives, that you add the demand, that it's still going to change the behaviour of the supplier, because in a sense they're the gatekeepers as well.
But is it a necessary but not sufficient condition, or is it not even necessary?
Well, I think it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So you have to get the demand up, but you can't do it on its own. Sorry, go on.
If we come back to the original question then, so you do accept that it's necessary to increase consumer demand, in which case, how do we avoid that putting too high a cost burden on consumers?
Yeah, so coming back to my answer, I think in order to avoid putting too great a cost burden on consumers is dealing with the fact that because it's necessary but not sufficient, the sufficient part is changing the behaviour of the suppliers. And so actually focusing on that as a way and mechanism to raise consumer demand in tandem with behavioural change of suppliers is what's needed. And at the same time, that doesn't put the burden on the consumers. What it does do is put some burden on the workforce. And that, I think, is actually where we're kind of getting to, that there needs to be this shift in both consumer demand and workforce behaviour.
So my next question is about incentivising consumer take-up without the government having to make significant fiscal commitments. But it sounds like where you want the fiscal commitments to go is in shaping the behaviour of the suppliers.
That's my opinion from the work that I've done in talking to suppliers and doing that. That would be my.
And in that case, how can that be done without fiscal commitments from the government?
I'm not sure it can be.
Right.
I think there is some cost associated with that.
Richard, Hanna, I think you've commented on this in your written evidence.
Yeah, so I mean, in addition to there's the £7,500 boiler upgrade scheme grant that covers air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, individual installations. But in addition to that, I think it's pretty important that we look at the different ways potentially of rebalancing the relative cost of electricity and gas, because more green levies are levied on the price of electricity compared to gas. That itself, there's different ways of doing that, but potentially if you could get the relative cost of electricity down, that would help to reduce running costs of heat pumps, and that may help to encourage more innovative business models in the sector amongst the suppliers, such as heat as a service. But there are also other ways in which you can use sort of smart tariffs or flexibility to reduce heat pump costs as well, or wider scale market reform. And again, I'm not saying, again, a lot of that may entail, more fiscal commitments as well. But in addition to that, so something that certainly can be done without fiscal commitment so much is just trying to generate positive case studies of heat pump installations, for example, for early adopters, and to actually have good data to measure heat pump performance. And that transparency in data in turn can help weed out bad installations and bad installers. But I think this issue of quality, the actual quality of, say, building retrofit installations is really important. For example, there have been lots of issues with, say, solid wall insulation in the eco schemes and quality of those, and issues with installers who don't understand much about the negative implications that some of those installations can have on the building. So something like the microgeneration certification scheme, there's still a lot of say heat pumps, for example, that are installed outside of that scheme because only companies rather than individual tradespeople need to be certified by that scheme. So I think actually policy which is targeted at improving the quality of installations helps to build reputation. I think that's a key thing that should be prioritised.
Can I just follow up? Sorry.
I'm coming back to you in a minute, but I think you've got one more question.
One more question. Do you want me to ask that?
You ask that, and then we'll go
as well. Okay. So I think finally, is there anything that the third sector, that the government can do to stimulate further the existing efforts that others are making to increase demand, like third sector and early adopters? Is there anything?
So I think in terms of green jobs more generally, I think that there's, and as we were saying before, there's a low kind of public awareness. Public don't even really know what a green job is, right? But actually just making the public at large more aware of career opportunities that are available in low carbon and green industries is something that the government could look to do through sort of national campaigning.
Hophouse.
Oh, just very quickly, but we've sort of moved on. I mean, a real-life example that I remember was I wanted to buy an electric vehicle, and the guy in the sales room absolutely wanted to sell me a combustion engine. And I thought, is that because they are actually also committed to selling their stock, or have they got a sort of an agreement with their suppliers that they sort of push for the old things and the old models before they're going into the new ones? I mean, it all sort of is related to each other, that you then don't get the workers or the people promoting that you should go to the new product rather than buying an old one. But
we've had evidence of a big stock of gas boilers as well.
Yeah.
Similar point, isn't it? But is that what you're finding?
That's exactly the point that I was making. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much.
Can I follow up on that in terms of the regulatory environment, particularly when we're talking about housing and retrofit and making sure that people have the right kit? How useful would it be for us to have a significant reform of EPC, which at the moment creates some perverse incentives where heat pumps don't get you any points on EPC, insulation can do, but not always. Those kind of things. What kind of appetite do you think that would have to create the demand that we're talking about?
I mean, it would be extremely useful. I think that would be a real game changer, to be honest, because EPCs they're not based at all on real world monitoring data. It's a points-based system. It's ridiculous. So I think that could then create a framework to incentivise, say homeowners, for example, to actually look to either improve their properties in terms of their energy performance, or indeed buy properties with better energy performance, knowing that those properties actually have proper measured performance and not a scale which is just completely unreliable.
And can I follow up on that's very helpful, thank you. And can I follow up a little bit on the supply of labour? Again, because I know Claire's asked a little bit about third sector and so forth, but again, the local authority can actually make a big difference on this. Particularly those that have assets, particularly homes, can recruit, arguably train or commission the training for those employees, and then create a workforce who, once they've finished, forgive me for the, fit and forget, but at least get it all installed in all the social housing, which then means you've got a trained workforce that have at least got some starting skills that might be transferable to the private sector, including the private renters sector. What role can you see in local authorities in developing that workforce that could be that supply element of the equation?
If that can be done well, then, and you have positive case studies of installations resulting from direct labour organisation workforces, then that would...
They don't even need to be direct labour organisations, do they? It can be commissioned.
Yeah. Well, it's just if it was a direct labour organisation, that might have some advantages in terms of helping to maximise the sort of consistency of competencies in that workforce. If you start contracting labour, you come back to the whole issues that you have in the construction industry more widely.
You can see a role for local authorities in being able to contribute to this workforce supply.
Can I just jump on that briefly? I think so, definitely. And particularly in Scotland, and probably around the UK, I'm not quite sure, sorry. You have the LHES, the Local Heating Energy Efficiency System Plan. So local authorities have dictated that they need to do a plan on...
I think that's only in Scotland.
Okay, it's only in Scotland. But we have seen that, and they have that remit, and they need to do it, and kind of integrating the workforce in that plan, I think will be very beneficial.
Right. And I need to follow up.
You're on to
incentives and tax
funding.
Yeah. Having said all of that, in my pro-statist mindset, do we really need to be spending public purse incentivising workers to take up jobs which should already be quite rewarding, long-term, highly, comparatively well paid? Why are we chucking good money at this when the private sector should be able to pay people well enough to do this?
I can start with that, if that's okay. I think that's a fair point, and of course you want to get the best value of your taxpayers' money. I think it goes back to that policy certainty and the right signals to the private sector to actually chip in money and crowd in investment. And we have had that, and we looked at in our Energy Demand Research Centre research on energy efficiency, that if you've targeted public funds on energy efficiency to tackle fuel poverty, for example, that will kickstart the supply chain around it, that crowd in funding to retrofit all households, for example. So that's the positive element here and gives that element of certainty. Also, the investment from government can help the private investment. We have seen that with renewables, with the CFDs. Because of the CFDs, the costs have been brought down. So there is a role there. But I guess the main final outcome here is what you get out of this is you get warmer and more efficient homes. And we have done lots of research on that, and there's lots of research available. A warmer home, more efficient home will give more money back to people, and that it brings a better economic return for the household, but also across the economy. You can have more money to spend in other things outside your home. But also, co-benefits of warmer homes, less sick people, increased productivity, education attainment, cost to the NHS. So there's a bunch of things that we should keep in mind, not only thinking about the direct energy bill return, but on the wider sense.
We hear a lot about this from economists. We have yet to convince the Treasury of this particular benefit to the overall, not just public purse, but economy. Professor Robson, to what extent can public expenditure solve the workforce issues highlighted today?
Well, I mean, I think this is linked to the previous answer. It's clear to me that, as I've been advocating for a strongly coordinated approach, that public expenditure sits at the heart of this. And I think that the point that you make about local authorities is really key here. The question you asked earlier on was why hasn't it happened before? And I think money is key, lack of funding. So putting money towards that seems like an absolutely essential part. I think it's also part of a broader place-based approach to education and training. But I don't think that public expenditure can solely be the driving force here. We do have to bring in investment from employers. That's key as well. And as I highlighted before, I don't have a particular answer for incentivising employers to increase investment in education and training, other than changing the structures with which they are involved in the system. So actually providing a much more engaged role for them through organisations like Skills England and so on and so forth, I think is part of that, to ensure that voice and responsibility are key to it. And that's how you get that sort of balanced partnership investment between public and private.
We have a shortage of people who can train young people. Yeah. What could public expenditure do to help with that?
Pay people in vet more. Absolutely. Just okay. Teachers and trainers need to be paid more.
Especially competitive with what they can do with installing a kitchen down the road. Yes. Dr. Hanna, within the existing constraints, are there better ways to assign public spending to ensure that workforce is in place?
Well, the first point I'd make is I think, again, as the panel have said many times, that a predictable and consistent policy environment can help to ensure we make the best use of public spending, but also incentivise potentially the industry and companies to actually invest in longer term training initiatives. So I actually, there are examples of, say, industry collaboration, such as, so I think it's SSE and Equinor with the Dogger Bank wind farm. So they've set up, say, a £1 million offshore wind community fund, and it's supporting basically local education projects in North Yorkshire, and then actually it's locally led as well. So local skills stakeholders can propose which sort of STEM learning activities they want from that community fund. So that's quite a good example of more of a sort of industry-led initiative in this space. Doesn't quite answer your question really, but
no, it's interesting though to find ways that you can get the money elsewhere.
Yeah.
Because I don't know whether we've all accepted that there's not much money around. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I have... Oh, sorry, Claire Young, you had a question as well.
Yeah, it was just following up on that final point about better ways of assigning existing spending. One thing that's been raised with me locally with regards green jobs is whether the unspent apprenticeship levy could be localised and used within the local further education college network to better support skills training in the area. What would your views on that be? I'm not sure who that's a question to really. Potentially follows on from the question to Dr. Hanna. But.
I'm trying to develop some work on apprenticeships in low carbon heat with the MCS Foundation actually. So I don't have an answer yet, but I know from talking to them that lots of colleges, they might be teaching things that don't necessarily need locally at the moment. So I think there's probably that further integration with the employers to work together to make sure that you get a little bit better planning on what we should be teaching. And that could be because of funding, that they don't have enough funding to bring new teachers to develop the new courses, but also just general coordination and they don't know what exactly is useful for the local community. So maybe this could be an interesting way of doing it. I'm open to that.
Thank you very much. And a final question from me, and it's really a yes or no answer from each of you, if we can. Will we achieve the Clean Power 2030 target, and will we decarbonise buildings by 2050 without further government intervention in workforce planning? I'll just ask you each in turn to say yes or no.
Unlikely.
I thought the way around that. Richard Hanna?
No.
Okay. And James Robson? No. Okay, and unlikely in two no's. Well, with that degree of unanimity, we finish the session. Can I thank you all, Professor James Robson, Dr. Christian Calvillo, and Dr. Richard Hanna for your evidence this afternoon, for the extensive written evidence you provided beforehand, and for agreeing to follow up on a number of issues that have been raised with you this afternoon. Thank you again, and that is the end of the session. Order.